only significant but historic. But given the number of upcoming events where we can be more prepared, my preference today is to limit my remarks to a few things that can allow anyone who is already aware of what's going on here today to view it as a culmination of things that have been necessary for at least the past 150 to 160 or more years, the past 250 or longer, the past 1,000, 2,000 years or longer. And if you look at what Chairman Daniels of the Friends of the African Union, who has established a permanent forum for people of African descent at the United Nations and a compact for democracy with a hashtag just economy. Those are the things that have taken many years to create a permanent forum at the United Nations that allows the people, the black, the people of color, the black indigenous people of color and allies to have a permanent forum at the United Nations that allows us to protect ourselves worldwide, all people of African descent and all indigenous people of color and allies from hostile governments. The reason that that's important is that as hostile as the United States government has clearly been, at least half of it during what we call the First Civil War, and then since then, for the past 160 years, it has, at least much of it has remained no less hostile toward the group of people who are in this room initiating these global projects. Nevertheless, there has been a very significant part of America, of the United States of America, that has not only not been hostile toward our black, indigenous people of color and allied folks who have finally succeeded at establishing a permanent forum at the United Nations, but we are now noticing a challenge politically and in our government that seems to be threatening to attempt to undo all of the progress that the democratic principles and hopes of the nation have clearly been making substantial progress within. So as you can notice, I'm basically delivering these preliminary remarks off the top of my head. I have significant plans to present my work in a more formatted way. But today, before I get started with any of my work, I must tie together the acknowledgement of the importance of the permanent forum of the people of African descent at the United Nations and encourage anyone who is becoming familiar with this for the first time or around now to expect us to get into all of the history and all of the things that were necessary in order to bring that about. I will want you to learn more about the Dr. Worley group that has put this together and has brought our opportunities into the Brownsville Heritage House where we are now. And then my work is an extension of the principles and the important work that they and others like-minded throughout the world have been doing. And it is an honor, a privilege for me to have met them and to have been invited into a series of lectures which are a reawakening of some of the work that I had been involved in back in the 1980s, in 1990s, the early 2000s, and then into the mid 2000 teens, when at the United Nations, my band and some of my projects related to my Healthy Therapeutic Music Research Lab were also invited to participate at the United Nations with Chairman Daniels in 2016. So please forgive me, perhaps this will be edited in a way that As we accumulate our collection of information, it will be smoother, but I think that it's important for anyone that this is actually completely new to understand that this is a coalition of activities for the like-minded and important things that we all need to maintain the value of the democratic principles that have erased chattel slavery in the United States of America, but only partially, without voting rights. That took then another 100 years to arrive at voting rights when the slaves were given freedom, but without voting rights. And then the 60 years since the voting rights were implemented, as we've noticed, as difficult as that was to achieve with the freedom riders or freedom fighters, Fannie Lou Hamer, and all of the other political activity of the 1960s and 70s, we are now seeing a reawakening in an open way of those things that were roundly rejected by the United States, by the United States government, as well as by the citizens of the United States when it first began to really seriously raise its head in the late 1950s, on top of all of the previous racism that we had seen going on before the arrival of the United Nations. So I ask for your patience with me. I do have a completely organized way of presenting my own work, but I must give credit to the World Group that has invited me here, to the director of the Brownsville Heritage House, Miriam Robertson, who I don't see here. I definitely want to thank my friend Joki, who found out only this morning that there would be an event and was on his way, knowing that the medicine men of Doc Jones and the medicine men will be here with me again on Saturday. And I need you to know that each of the people who are here today are a part of history. Each of the people who are observing this today are also. That is my view of it. Now, to keep my remarks simple and somewhat understandable, I'm hoping that a few metaphors may be useful. Imagine if whatever a person's plans for their career or what they may do after high school lead them into university or college. Some will be undecided. They don't know. They know they want to go to college. They're not sure what they want to be. Others have known what they wanted to be from first grade or earlier. Maybe it has to do with what the parents did or some other suggestion from a teacher who influenced them early. And they've been on their way to doing that from as long as they can remember. While other people may be absolutely certain of what they want to do when they go into the university or college, but then they find out when they get there that there's something else of their interest. By using that metaphorically, I think that it will be maybe somewhat helpful to understand that what happened to me was that very early that did happen. I was told that because I was interested in anatomy, when my second grade teacher asked, what did I want to be? And as soon as I said anatomy, she said, well, that's what doctors use, and she encouraged me to become a doctor. So for almost all of my early and later public education in Maryland, land of free, the home of the brave, Baltimore, Fort McHenry, rejected the British, and basically Star Spangled Banner, land of free, home of the brave. I grew up there, public school, and came out of a public school that was collegiately prepared through its advanced curricula to provide to the Johns Hopkins University with students right out of high school who were ready to enter the university at the graduate level. I wasn't aware of that when I was there. I learned about it later when I read the inaugural address of Daniel Gilman. But I do encourage anyone who's unfamiliar with that to think about what would happen if wherever a person is throughout the world, whether you end up in Baltimore or such a place as that, where there are public high schools that are collegiately prepared to train students who come in 2.5, 3, or more grades ahead by 12 in the middle schools, to accelerate through those and through high school in a way that they would enter even the most challenging universities, especially research institutions, as graduate students when they leave high school. Mine was one of those in Baltimore, older than Johns Hopkins, which was named and mentioned in its inaugural address as such. So by giving you this information, I think that it can be somewhat useful now, as I introduce myself and what I think is going on, and to try to be brief, that I went into Johns Hopkins on a scholarship that was left over out of my high school that could only be used if the student went to Johns Hopkins. I didn't know that. When I got to Johns Hopkins, I met people who had come in from all over the country at the top of their academic circles, many from New York, in fact, and lived with them as a freshman by virtue of that scholarship, which gave me the additional money that I needed to not have to commute. 50 years later, I'm still in touch with many of my friends from the dormitory experiences that I had as a freshman there. There were very few of us. I came in at a time when there was no such thing as a black student union, more than within the 2 or 3 years before I arrived. And many of the students who created the Black Student Union, or BSU, at Johns Hopkins, went on to extraordinary careers, and in fact are honored by the university with distinguished awards, doctors of letters, etc., because they brought to the attention of the university back then how important it was for it to not overlook the talent that was coming out of the African American, the indigenous, the people of color communities that prior to that, our arrival there, would have always gone to a historically black college, or even if not, who may not have been accepted at the Johns Hopkins University. So I hope that that's enough to at least give you some background. Later on, if I am able to continue to do this in a series, now I can spend more time in organizing it and making sure that I'm able to deliver my remarks less casually than I have been now. So the metaphor, such a person arrives then, goes into the pre-medical studies, onto medical school, trains, meets a fellow woman who also trains in medicine, has a family, does all of the usual things, becomes a faculty member at one of the Albert Einstein campuses in emergency medicine, later at the Columbia University teaching faculty. But along the way, the metaphor is that such a person eventually is treated like someone who has an MD, PhD, as opposed to an MD alone, and then discovers other things that they might have also gone into that results in them being treated like an MD, PhD, 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 in areas where they had not trained at the graduate level and where they have no training networks. So if such a person then discovers things that a lot of money has been spent looking for hundreds, if not thousands of years, where some of that money is still being spent today, it's not that easy to reach out to someone within those fields and to explain how it is that such a person as myself is the one who found something that Isaac Newton had spent 10 years looking for, or something that thousands of years of research by the most brilliant mathematicians in the world, in the history of the world, have been looking for, that are still being looked for today. That I'm a person that happened to. I happen to know some people at Hopkins in those fields. I reached out to them and was able to present some of my mathematical findings in a new mathematics conference at Johns Hopkins. I was able to present some of that work having to do with Isaac Newton at Princeton, Johns Hopkins, Harvard, and so on, Clay Mathematical Institute. And so it's not that easy to bring that out in less than the amount of time that I've been trying to explain what I'm about to show you now. But I encourage you to look into as much of this for yourselves as you can. And I use as an example of it my own phone. And if it's anything like yours, an African American from a historically black college invented digital cellular technology and has made billions, if not trillions of dollars in industry from his inventions out of Bell Labs, Stanford, MIT, a wireless services AT&T directorship, who has recently asked me to provide him with the numbers that he needs in order to launch a new generation of phones, and that if he relies on the way that people usually find those numbers, he won't be able to get them. But why would it be a doctor and not a computer scientist or a mathematician or et cetera, that he could easily go to for those numbers? I'm not going to go into that now. I'm only going to explain that if you use that metaphor in all of the other fields in which this has occurred, I'm a person who happened to hear music in a way that a professional composer hears music, but I never realized that that was my music when I thought it was remnants of things that I had heard. When my children brought pianos into the house, I found out that it was me. I started making music as a kind of one-man band in a professional studio, and was invited to air some of it, became a member of the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, and you were listening to some of the music that came from the band of artists that I work with as Doc Jones and the Medicine Men, who were with me in 2016 at the United Nations, and who will be with us again here on Saturday evening. That said, on this table, there's work from the archaeological historiography, the archaeological anthropology, some of the ancient mathematics, some things that need to be checked from ancient inventions that are attributed to the Kemetic or ancient Egyptian work, the important work that launched the computer out of the difference engines, some work that was done by the founder of the African Scientific Institute that you can read about in what PBS had to say when he left us a few years ago. Is a very close friend of mine. Matter of fact, I am also a fellow of the African Scientific Institute, as is chairman of FAU, Herschel Daniels. This work, Principles of Relativity, is an important work because Whitehead, who trained Bertrand Russell, proved that a well-trained philosopher could use symbolic logic to check the general theory of relativity. And why that was significant is that he did that right after the eclipse of 1921, when even with Einstein's information and the eclipse and et cetera, there still had not been any rigorous mathematical physics or philosophical or logistic-based analysis of exactly what it was that Einstein was saying. This is a book that I would say anyone who hasn't seen this, if you're looking at quantum computing, entanglement, all of these kinds of things are things that it took more than 100 years from the time that Einstein had conjectured them in order to become or to have any kind of industrial value. And I need my audiences, or people who hear or learn of what has happened to me, to expect that what we find today in research, we use 100 years or more later, because there's so very often a fair amount of hypothetical or, information within the discoveries that still needs to be checked, developed, or established in that way. This book is important because it shows that the Egyptians sent fleets to the west seeking the land of the sunset thousands of years ago. And to the extent that some people believe that those Egyptians were African people, black people, it's probably not the reason that there were indigenous black people in the United States or in America when they arrived. But whoever came here from that far away mingled with the people of Mesoamerica, Central America, South America, North America from those trips. This is the only source of that kind of information that I've seen. It doesn't mean that there aren't other books like that. And finally, that the work having to do with Stonehenge gave me reason to check thousands and thousands of pages that were left over by an Englishman who was curious to know just who had built Stonehenge in the British Isles. And that work led me into the Indus Valley civilizations and into the cultures that were responsible for megalithic architecture throughout the world. So for now, if I can, I would like to just look at my list. HIJ is the initials for the Board of Education seminar that I was allowed to bring this information to the New York City Board of Education. And I'd like to revisit that in some of my future events. But HIJ is Historical Integrity Judged. Why that's important to me is that people have different sources of information that convince them that they're correct about certain things, and they automatically shut out anyone who isn't using that information. Now, I'm not sure as such, I don't want to overrun my time.
You're good.
If I'm good. I'd like to elaborate on that. A lot of things I try to do are hypothetical. But my idea was, what if a large number of people were given to believe certain things, they read, they saw, and they developed cultures or communities that were reliant on that information. And as time went on, they separated themselves from people who did not use that bulk of information. But the things that they needed were the exact same things that another group of people near them, who they would love to work with, were using other information that they had not seen, and vice versa. So what I did in my seminar, I created Historical Integrity Judged. And that just means if you would love to work with someone, but for some reason they're using ideas or information that doesn't fit in with yours, bring it. Let's see it. I'm convinced that even if you don't change, even if you want to stick with your information, knowing why someone doesn't agree with you helps you and them to understand the differences between you and makes it easier for you to work with each other without having to change what you believe. That's a hypothetical consideration, but I used it when I created the curriculum, and the Board of Education actually sent me to a number of well-known, well-regarded, highly ranked university professors in African studies with whom they were familiar, and I had no idea who any of them were because I was coming in from medicine. I did not know anything about what was going on, and I'm embarrassed to say, but I didn't know anything about quote-unquote African studies, African history, all of the professors, any of that. I disappeared into medicine for almost, 12 years, 15 years after high school before I even found out about any of this kind of information. But thankfully, the Board of Education here in New York knew of those professors. They sent me to one when they saw my information, and for those who are unfamiliar with him, as I was not at that time, but those also who are familiar with African studies. The professor that the Board of Education sent me to was Professor John Henry Clark. And when I brought my material that was coming from an Englishman who had spent 10 hours a day for 20 years looking into who had built Stonehenge, who had written that work 150 years before I found it in books that were out of print, it turns out that professor was familiar with that work. And he thought that what I had done with it was important, and he told the Board of Education that, and I was able to create my seminar with him as my principal consultant. His name is Professor John Henry Clark, and anyone who is familiar with his work would know what he has done to raise the awareness of who black people in the ancient world have accomplished to a level that has brought that old antiquarian work back into press. So I expect that as time goes by, it'll be easier to learn about more of this. I'm kind of on the fly today. Let me show you another couple of things here, if you can see that. Now, from my work, these were Etruscans, and those are the people who fought with the Romans and then had a treaty with them. And people who were scholars of that era may disagree with me, but my understanding is that Etruria and the Romans fought and then came to an agreement that allowed both to live in Italy in, I think, kingdoms, and then a republic, and then an empire of some kind, with migration out of the mid hundreds BC through Caesar and then beyond Caesar. Now, a comment there that is significant is that by 300 AD, the ancient Romans left Italy and migrated to Byzantium. There are important works about who they were and how their empire continued well into the 1400s, to the point that the final day when they signed ancient Rome out of existence was recorded to the day. And a person can read about who they were, what was an issue for the black Roman aristocracy. The pictures that I've seen of Diocletian and the other emperors with their noses cut off, the work that I've seen in Roman art, which I've provided you, by the way, Sacha, with the Roman art of Yves d'Ambra, that depicts or shows the tiling and the mosaics of those people. You would have to go to Harlem today if there were a show on Broadway depicting the actors in her scene. If their flight was detained, you would have to go to Harlem to quickly find people who could match the images of those people on the cover of her work. And it's very important, if anyone has used Yves d'Ambra, to know that when you order that book, I believe there's one out of Princeton Press, and then there's another out of Cambridge Press. When you order that, or at least when I did, I got the Roman art that did not have the picture on it. So and I ordered it from the ISBN that does have the picture. So you have to understand that people have already been trained to believe certain things, and it's easier for them to remain in their group. They may feel pressure to not leave it or to let anything into it. We're not going to be dealing and wrestling with that. We need to know what actually happened so that we can behave like normal people and not like people who have changed a lot of things or who have inherited their government, their culture, and everything else, their norms and expectations from people who have already changed things, and then who are going to tell us that we are revisionists in history. I don't think so. Okay, revisionist history happened when people changed who was there into their images. And now they're telling us that we can't restore what we have found so that anyone can know about it. So let me migrate away from that quickly. From the HIJ, I have the Pathological Antisocial Thinking Project. And what it does is it takes antisocial thinking and it accepts a certain amount of it. Now, Oscar the Grouch, I hate my mother. Okay, nobody's gonna go after somebody who's saying or thinking those kinds of things unless they become organized and go out and try to kill everyone's mother or, terrible things. But what I did was I defined pathological antisocial thinking as the kind of antisocial thinking that cannot be protected by the First Amendment. Not that any of it can, or should be, but just the same, if we tolerate that amount of it, that it's how some people feel, but it doesn't spread from them to others. It doesn't threaten everyone else. If you separate that into the kind of antisocial thinking that clearly does, my work was attempted to address how to prevent, how to treat if it occurs, how to cure if it occurs, and how to eradicate globally if it occurs. That form or those forms of antisocial thinking. So I called that the clinical epidemiology of pathological antisocial thinking among individuals and groups. And I'm able to take a look at that scientifically enough to urge public health institutions, policy, government to address it and to stop dancing around it. We do not protect people who are threatening us with the kinds of things that Hitler threatened his people with. To run quickly more through these things, Discover was the first book that I had written that attempted to boil down some of the Englishman's findings. One of my friends, a professor at Johns Hopkins, saw some of it after a recent trip he had taken to Egypt with the chairman of the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Johns Hopkins. And I stopped by and he asked me what I was working on. I showed him and I told him that I had recently been invited to present some of my work at Harvard and that I refused to do it unless it could be peer reviewed. And he called the professor who had arranged for that trip that he had just returned from that earlier that summer. And he noticed how often the news was calling that professor because he had been credited with authenticating the Dead Sea Scrolls. And when he saw black Romans, Christ black, and all of these kinds of things in the Englishman's work, he was stunned by it and he said that it was news, called the chairman, and 5 minutes later I was in the chairman of Near Eastern Studies office. He reviewed the work and asked me, told me that he couldn't dispute a word of it, and wondered how it was that Johns Hopkins had missed it. With that review, I accepted the invitation to do the lecture at Harvard, but only if they would also extend the invitation with the honorarium to the self-taught Sanskrit scholar who had learned this information at the time that the United Nations was being formed. And had it not been for him, a self-taught Sanskrit scholar, African American, out of an historical black college, I wouldn't have known anything about that work. Harvard accepted that, and they did invite him. We did 2 lectures in 1985 during National Black History Month, and that's how my awareness and exposure into this area began. I'm trying to use it as much as I can, either clinically or in public health or in ways that people who are in government or in other industry or wherever they are can be aware of who we are. And no, we did not catch up. We were ahead. We've been ahead, just like every other group of people has people at the top of itself that are ahead. We are being approached as though somehow things have to be done for us to catch up. We need to make sure that our children understand we have never had to do that, and we are not going to do that. We will continue to be the people who, if any observer has noticed what was presented in the oldest unsolved math problem and the panoply of extremely brilliant, exclusively preoccupied with mathematics, geniuses that have still to this day not recognized how to find the sets of numbers that my work has been presented and found to locate instantly, that those kinds of people come from us, and those kinds of people come from Jewish people like Einstein, and they come from all kinds of groups of people. But my message about that, how many Einsteins do we need? Once you have one, and I'm not saying I am, but once you have one person like that, the work that they do takes hundreds of years sometimes to really pay attention to in a way that it becomes widely useful, number one. And number two, that doesn't mean that the people who hate Jewish people changed because Einstein happened. He had to run from them, and he was fortunate to find a safe haven at the IAS at Princeton. Now, if you go through the rest of my list, I would think that from there, the things that I would want you to see from my work are, it would begin with the Taipei Times. And I sent the Taipei Times to Sacha, and I would like that to be where a lot of this begins, because it's Taiwan, and it discusses very, very vividly the extermination of the indigene there, the black indigene in China. Now, why that's also significant is that they have a celebration, if you will, to honor the little people that they exterminated there. But it's like, that's what happened. We need to do more than just say they were exterminated, they were black, they were indigenous, they were Chinese, and that's the end. That's not it. And that's not what the world did with it. The world was so shocked, I guess you could say, by that kind of information, that the reports to confirm that those people were black are still being reported as recently as 2024. So we need to remove any doubt that the mothers who are expecting children, the mothers who have very, very young children, the mothers whose children are on their way into education systems, the mothers who are getting their children through the education system, near the end of the secondary, I guess it would be, education system, on their way into college or however it is that they can then expect to have careers and a life. We need to get rid of that. It's gone. We need to be familiar with the information that allows us to reconnect with who we are. And I would say that in that way, the part that I would like to really bring out now has to do with the idea of the University of Scientific Artists. I believe that when we have that, it's different from a university of scientists and artists, and that wasn't a criticism. I believe that such places as universities of scientists and artists have a more challenging, but in some ways perhaps a more lofty outcome or expectation of outcome, because I believe that those groups are quite different Their needs are different, their expectations are different, their methodology is different. But the scientific artist is a person who was an artist who found out that they could do math or physics or some computer science, or a physicist who found out that they could paint. And so when you have that sort of thing in you already, the institutions that I'm hoping the concept of the University of Scientific Artists represents is a group of like-minded individuals who have that particular combination of skills. And I'm hoping that the world will also recognize, and by that WERLED and WORLD, United Nations and the world of the future, will recognize that both of those concepts are important, that there may be frequent channels between such places, and that at the very least, we can become part of the vanguard that stands up against the erasure of our culture and of our people simply because of people who don't know who we are, can't believe who we are when they find out, and treat us like we don't have the right to teach ourselves about ourselves after they've changed what we found out about ourselves. Not going to be acceptable. Finally, when Hitler did it, if you use his example, he did things that people today are afraid could happen again. The majority of the people who were there when it was happening got out as early as they could, and the ones who didn't, we know what we've learned has happened to them. What I want to, if this is the only time that I do this, and it won't be, but if it were, I would say, if you fear that, they don't deserve it. The home of the brave, be familiar with that. Be brave to the last second of your life, even if you knew it was coming. And if they had a list with your name on it and you knew what time and day they were coming for you. Don't become like them. Don't think that you can't speak up, that you have to hide. We scared the hell out of them. And now they felt that they would be losing their numbers in the electoral, and they've done some peculiar things, and they're making people think that what Hitler did could happen again. Well, if it could or if it does, be brave. Don't be afraid of it. It's a liar, okay? We scared the hell out of them, and they've always known who we are, many of them. But now, lately, with the mixture and progress, they've resorted to villainizing Franklin Roosevelt. That's not gonna fly. Okay, so then let me just run through the rest of my list. I sent you the Willendorf, which is important because Joel Rogers saw the Venus of Willendorf. He establishes the presence of the Willendorf in the center of Europe as the heart of where we lived, very close to 25,000 years ago. And on that note, it is important to go ahead and say, that it was very important to say that that our history extends globally for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and Monty and Sancho were able to remind me, millions of years globally, long before that. So we're not trying to take anything away from anybody by creating the American Society of Ancient African American Studies, which is one of my organizations, the American Journal of Ancient African American Studies, the American Society of Meso-African American Studies, the American Society of Meso-African American Studies. We're not taking anything away from people who have been there longer than the slaves that were brought over, or longer than the indigenous populations of Black Indians who were here at around that time by reclaiming those lands as part of our ancestry. And no, I'm not representing myself as an authority in any of those areas, but what I have found in those areas is often cited, used, etc., by authorities in those areas. And in fact, I presented some of my work at the Carnegie Institute when the Mayan lecture in Washington, D.C. occurred, and there were only 3 black people there. And I was like, no, 3 blacks at the Mayans. And I had all of these photographs from Bonham Pack and, you know, things from Clyde Winter's work and the Mali and the other things that are there, San Lorenzo. And the professor wouldn't allow me to show them to his audience. But he acknowledged that Morley and Thompson wrote the Encyclopedia of Archaeology, and they weren't going to accept that it was us in those areas that long, to such an extent that when you see those giant, clearly African heads in Mexico, Morley and Thompson blamed that on something. They would say, oh, well, you see, what they did, whatever. And then every archaeologist bought that because that's what they were being trained. I don't buy that either, okay? But I'm just saying that professor was very kind to me after. He offered to repeat his lecture at Johns Hopkins. He sent a professor from the New York Times who had written on the Olmec in the Science Times to do a lecture for the students at Hopkins, maybe 10 years Chijobi before you were there. And we had Michael Blakey, who had excavated the African American burial grounds, take that lecture because of the professor from the New York Science Times could not accommodate the date. So finally, I think I've already said, I found some math. And when you look at the panoply of giants at the top who are still looking today, spending money for the particular set of numbers that I find with formulas. He noted at the beginning of that math presentation that you showed that for thousands and thousands of years, everybody has been looking for these things. That what you should know is that what I found those numbers, the prime numbers that are used in the internet cybersecurity and the RSA algorithm and all that kind of stuff, public and private access keys. You could almost say that I found those prime numbers by accident. In fact, you can say it, because I was finding them while looking for a completely different set of numbers. So here it is. Please give me a cue in the event that I'm overrunning, and I apologize, you can edit me, but as it turns out, this will be my lead into my finale, okay? So I was looking at the Newton problem because in physics at Hopkins, I learned that Newton spent 10 years looking for a point that he could write the math for, and then to take that point and stick it in the center of a mass, call it the center of gravity, and calculate the physics of gravity with it. 10 years into that search for the math for the point, he was like, look, when am I going to write the gravity paper? And he gave up on it and decided to define the point as a vanishing point between two interfacing planes. And so when we learned physics, that's how we learned it. You just get the planes closer and closer, you have the limit, and when you get there, there's a point in there. But I was always curious to know, why would somebody like that, one of the smartest people I ever heard of, invented his own calculus, he was in every area, this man, Newton, was a giant. Why would he waste 10 years on a problem that couldn't be solved? And so as it turns out, I had a few months at the Pentagon to think about things, and I was curious, why? And how might someone who had more time have worked on that? And it turns out the way that I looked at it worked. And I met a U.S. Math Olympiad who was on the U.S. Math team, chairman of the Department of Infinity Math, and he asked me a few questions on the phone when I met him, was introduced to him. I told him, no, that's not how you do that. No, that's not how you do it either. No. He invited me to his office. I went over and I thought I'd have a discussion with him about it. It turns out he allowed me to defend that work as though he had trained me. And he didn't want to scare me. He thought, you're not going to forget it. Nobody has that. And he was flown all over the world to attend thesis defenses for PhDs when mathematicians thought that they had solved that problem. And he created a list of challenges, 11 questions, and then whoever they were defending with would add him, and he would see how close to an actual point they had gotten based on his challenges. So he knew that nobody had ever done that, but he casually thought that he would entertain whatever it was that I was doing. And as it turns out, he told me at the end of my meeting with him that no one in the world had ever survived all 11 challenges. And I said, well, what do I do? And he said, what I do. And I said, what's that? And he said, publish it. So he gave me Leonardo and Scientific American, a few places, Discover, I think, and a few other magazines or something that he thought would be interested in. And I actually started to write some math. This a poster exhibited at the gallery at West Beth, where we all met with the director there. And then, so I just basically had written this one line thinking that somehow I would, and then I graphically allowed it to shrink itself. So my point is that that I found a point that was mathematically a point, and I defended it with the chairman of the Department of Infinity Math, and then that allowed me to look at other problems. And when I saw this perfect numbers that you just saw on the tape today, or the YouTube today that I sent, that was the first time that I ever saw the history of it, and that's why I sent it to you. I knew that Euclid's formula was what was being used, but I didn't know that who was the first and this and that. So what I'm going to say about it is that after Euclid showed how perfect numbers were found, people started looking for how to find more of them, and it took thousands and thousands of years before they got to the number that I'm about to say. Now, before I do, I'll tell you what perfect numbers are. Mathematicians call numbers perfect when they are equal to the sum of their proper multiplicative factors. And the best example, the simplest example of that is just the first number, which is 6. Its proper multiplicative factors minus itself are 3, 2, and 1. When you add 3 to 2 to 1, it's 6, so 6 is called perfect. It happens again at 28 because the proper multiplicative factors minus itself are 14, 7, 4, 2, and 1. When you add those, they're 28. It doesn't happen again until 496 because minus itself, what is it, 248, 124, 62, 31, 16, 8, 4, 2, and 1 are 496. Doesn't happen again, I may have erred there. Doesn't happen again until 8,128. Now, why I was curious about that is because, as it turns out, when you find these perfect numbers, every time you do, you find a prime number. And those prime numbers are the numbers that are used in the, those prime numbers are the ones that are used in internet security. So by speeding up, what I noticed was that although he had a formula, Euclid only went to 8,128. And I was like, why did he stop there? I looked at it, and because of the work I had previously done on the Newton, right away I could see that all of those numbers were triangular. I didn't know that's what they were called when I was doing the Newton problem, but triangular numbers, if you look, you could see that all of the perfect numbers were triangular, and I knew I could find all of those. So when I started to look more carefully at that, I found a formula that allowed me to find that after 8,128, the next perfect number was 33,550,336. And then after it, 8,589,869,056. After it, 137,438,691,328. And after it, 2 quintillion, 305 quadrillion, 843 trillion, 8,139,952,128. When I got to that, and remember I had to check each one. After that, I said the same thing that Euler said. Euler said, nobody is going to bother to look for any numbers bigger than that. Well, he was kind of wrong, because I could just find them all, but I got it. I said, if I'm going to find any more of these, I need to write a program that helps me, and I can find them all. Well, I have that. And that's why companies like the inventor of the digital cyber technology, if he wants those primes and he wants to use them for his next generation of phones, he can either go to the people who are still looking for how to find them more quickly through the great internet Mersenne Prime Search or the Electronic Future Foundation or however they're doing them, or he can come to me. So I want you to know that in my future presentations, I would like to bring out as many of these varieties of things that I've spoken of, and that I would like to remind you that I will want Doc Jones and the Medicine Men, the Healthy Therapeutic Music Research Lab, my interdisciplinary independent work out of the ResearchGate or utterly independent, to bring the scientific artists into the lab cleanly without any government or issues or anything else attached to it, so that we can safely evaluate the things that we need to, so that when we say, if we look at that with these, we can find out whether it's that or that we need to keep spending money on. I want to be able to do that, give our children our heritage, along with our alliances, an open route into the future that is not attached to a daily concern for harm that comes from hostile people who are determined to not only attempt to preserve the changes that they've made to create or establish a pseudo-dominance in the world, but to also use their own leverage and their own rules, their own monetary systems, to prevent us from recognizing ourselves, from restoring, from reclaiming, and from using what God has given to us in this world to do. Thank you very much.